In this section, we are discussing a question about the difference between all settled, and race method of promise. This question is of asynchronous JavaScript section, and there will be 4 relative questions we will have with this topic. We have already seen the use of promise object. We also discussed the resolve and reject methods, which are the most commonly used methods with promises. Though nowadays we go with async await rather than resolve and reject, which will be the next topic of our discussion. But in this section, we are discussing about these 3 methods. Now let's start with Promise.all method. The purpose is when you have multiple promises as input, it should return a single promise after all promises are resolved. Then you can use the all method. It will be something like this, that you have promise 1, promise 2, maybe few more processes, and each promise gets resolved and then it is passed as a parameter in the all method. So there might be multiple promises which are passed to the iterable object in the all method. Now when I say iterable, it means there can be any iterable object, but at the moment or most of the time we see that there is always an array which contains each promise reference. Mostly you see an array as an argument which has promises. Let's try a simple example to check this. I will create few promises at the moment. I'll say P1 is equal to new promise, which will have a callback function with 2 static functions, static methods, that is resolve and reject. And let's also put a set timeout here, which again has a callback function, and that gets executed, let's say, after 2000 milliseconds. Inside this, I'm just going to say resolve, and we are going to pass a message, that is promise 1. That's it. This is one promise we have created. Now let me also create 2 more promises this way. So there are 3 promises. I have P1, P2 and P3. So these are 3 objects we have which are handling the promise. Now let's say you want that when all these 3 processes are done, then it should return one promise. That's where you are going to use the all method. Let me configure all the promises with the all method. So I'll say Promise.all. Now here you are going to pass the iterable. So right now I'm putting an array, and as you see that we have P1, P2 and P3. These are the 3 promise references. So that's what I'm going to pass here. I'll say P1, P2 and P3. At the same time, each promise will return a different message. I'll say promise 2 and promise 3. Now I'm going to use the then here, which will receive a message. Here I'm going to say all the promises are sending messages here through resolve. So I'm going to say PRMSGS, that is promise messages or something. Any variable you take doesn't matter. Now I'm saying console log and will display the PR messages variable. So this is what the code is. We have the promise 1 which returns through resolve. Same is the case with promise 2 and promise 3. Each promise is returning a different message. Let's run and see what happens here. It has waited for 2 seconds. Each promise anyway takes 2 seconds only to execute. And you see that the PR messages now has this value collection, that is array of all the values which was returned by the resolve method. So here what we have done is that we have taken Promise.all method which has an iterable inside it. Then we are using the then method and we are proceeding with a callback function which gets all the messages of each promise. Let's try some modifications in the program. This P1 which we have here, let me just make this as P2, and instead of P3 I will say P1. So I'm changing the sequence. Now let's run the code and look at the output. You see that it has promise 2, promise 3 and promise 1. This is what the output is. The reason is you do not have to worry about in which sequence the promise is executed. It might happen that all of the promises at the moment have 2000 milliseconds, but let's say one promise may take more time. But the sequence will be followed in this message variable with reference to the sequence you have mentioned with the iterable. Now let's make it P1, P2 again. And let me show you by changing the timing. Let's say this P1 takes 4000 milliseconds. That is, after 4 seconds, this will be resolved. Whereas these two promises will be resolved in just 2 seconds. So ideally, you might think that this should be the last message, but that won't happen because the all method will check in sequence which is mentioned here in this array. Let me save this and run the code again. So after 4 seconds, you see that the promise 1 still stays at the same, that is at the first place. So now we know the basic syntax and behavior of all method. The code we see right now is returning resolved state in all cases. Let's try to change one of the promise by returning a reject state and see what happens. Let me just change this resolve to reject. Let me also change this 4000 to 2000 so that it doesn't take more time. Alright, so now what change I have made is I placed reject. I replaced resolve with reject. That is, now I just want to run this code. So after 2 seconds, you are facing an error. As you can see that now it has stopped working because the all method is settled with only and only resolved promises. And if any of the promise is returning error, then it won't work. Let me also add a catch with the all method, which is a proper way to write the code. So here I'm going to add a catch, which will again have the error object or the message which we are going to retrieve in this error object. And I will simply say console log. Let me display whatever is the value in the error. Now at the moment, reject will raise the error, but this promise value, that is promise 3, will be passed in this ERR, right? So when I clear this and run it again, at least this is the error section displayed for sure. Let me also add error here so you get the right message. Right? So if anything which displays with this error, it means it actually went in the catch section. So you see that it displays error promise 3. So in short, when all promises are expected to return success or resolved state, you can use the all method. But what if you have a possibility of error or rejection, which is equally possible? Most of the programs will have some or the other error as well. Now all will stop working. It will not run for other promises. It has stopped working for other promises, even if a single promise has returned an error. The way is that you use the all.settled method. All.settled method does help in this situation. It will wait for all the promises regardless of their state and will return promise at the end, no matter what is the state. That is, whether it's a resolved state or rejected or whatever, it is going to wait and run all the promises one by one. Let me simply add settle here. That's it. Now earlier it was giving the error. Now let's see what happens. The output says that you have array returned with some data, that is a kind of object literal we have, which has status and the value. So you see there are 3 object literals or 3 elements in short. fulfilled. The first promise was fulfilled, second was fulfilled with the value, and here the third one, the status is rejected and the reason is something, whichever error is displayed there, that will be the reason. So in short, this is how all settle and all differ. So the major difference you realize here is the all method will work when all the promises are returning the resolved state, whereas rejection will be handled better with all settle. Now let's talk about the Promise.race method. This method simply returns a promise as soon as any of the promise returns the state from the iterable list provided. Let's change the method allSettled to race and observe the output. Let me run the code. That's it. So it's a kind of race among promises. Whichever promise was executed first, that is returned with the race method. So what happens when you have a process? Let's say you have an API call, right? Multiple API calls, that is, and you want that if one of the API call is done, you want to come out with a new promise returned, then instead of writing all or all settle, you are going to use the race method. So here, when you say race method, it means it is going to race among each promise. Whichever wins, that gets executed. It means that, let's say this promise 3, let me reduce milliseconds here. So the promise 3 is executed, which was actually rejecting, but then also that got executed, and because we have returned the catch, it got caught in the catch section and it displays promise 3 here. Let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, what will be the output if the iterable is not a promise inside all method arguments? For example, as shown below, where P2 is not a promise. So the answer is that we have P2 as a normal variable. It's not exactly a promise. Now that is passed here in the iterable. So what happens? All method doesn't mind that. Not necessary that the mentioned element is a promise object. It can be any variable or anything that will automatically be part or a kind of element of this variable, that is PR messages. Let's save this and try to run and see what is the output. It's not going to give any error in short. You see that the array of PR messages does have promise 1, which was resolved, promise 3, which is again resolved, and the P2, the value of P2 is just a string, which is not a promise. That is also becoming a part of this PR messages variable. Second question is, how will you handle rejected multiple promises in the most efficient way? So we have already discussed that if you are using the all method, then it will work for all the resolved states. But if there is a rejection, if there is an error, then you can handle such a situation with all settled method. The third question is, explain the purpose of Promise.race method. Now we have already seen the syntax and execution, but it returns the promise as soon as any promise mentioned in the iterable list returns the state. Now that state can be resolved or reject, doesn't matter. The purpose of race method is sometimes you have multiple promises and you have a kind of setting where even if only one promise, whichever is executed first, if that is executed, you do not want other promises to execute. And that's the exact situation where the race method is useful. What will be the output of empty iterable if given as a parameter inside the race method as shown in this code? So race method is given an empty array, then the state will be pending. So this promise.race will always return a pending state. So this promise will never be resolved. Let's try that. I have this obj, that is the object. Now if I display the object here, it should display the pending state. And even after 2 seconds, if I display the value, that's going to be pending, right? So if there is an empty iterable, then it will be pending forever in case of race method. So let me just run the code. Pending, again pending, right? When will this situation happen? This race, the promise which you are having, that might be generated dynamically, and let's say no value is returned. So race will have empty array sometimes. Such cases will have pending state. But this is just a behavior which I am talking. That's why I have raised this question here. So in short, it will be pending forever.